Good morning and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live, produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company. I am your host, Bo Heckman, and I find myself once again in front of a very spooky house. The light is still on. That's the only light. So, yeah. Anyway, I'm back in front of this house because it's time for Rebecca again. And with us today is our guest reader, Amy. Amy, how are you?
Hey, good morning. I am well. How are you?
I don't know if it's morning or evening. It doesn't seem to change where I'm at here.
Well, so. Rebecca I'm sure that's Rebecca. She's just in that light. Mrs. Danvers leaves it on for her.
I expect Norman Bates to come down the porch at any moment and tap me on the shoulder. Where are we in the story of Rebecca?
We are almost to the end, ladies and gentlemen. We're only like 150 pages. I know. I mean, I'll miss everyone, and hopefully we can maybe book another one for me. But I was like, oh, but this means I can watch the movie like in the next couple of weeks.
You're free. You're free. You can watch the movie.
I can watch the new Netflix, which I've been waiting on. So we kind of lost Max for a little bit. We don't know exactly where he is. He went up to London and then he's back, and like it's a whole thing. And she's really I find that she's really dealing with. She's kind of, I don't know. She's kind of starting to push against Rebecca a little bit. Kind of starting to either like Rebecca's going to win or she's going to win. We don't know yet, which I find really interesting. Yeah, so I'm really excited. I'm really excited.
I should also say I have listed this as beginning at chapter 20 today. I was wrong with that. We are actually starting at chapter 19, if that is correct, Amy.
That is correct. We will start there.
Excellent. And we, in our comments section, we have a good morning to Bo and Amy from Stanley. Hello,
good morning, Stanley. Hello.
Doing well today. Yes. And Catherine James. Good morning, everyone. I've been looking forward to seeing this since this Thursday. I hope everyone's doing well.
I'm glad you're not reading today, Mo. My goodness.
I'm glad I'm not reading today.
Right. Oh, and I forgot to say, we got a big chunk of dialogue from Mrs. Danvers. Like Catherine and I had a nice talk about that, text talk, because Mrs. Danvers kind of freaked us all out last week. So, she kind of went off about how, you'll have to watch, but we got a nice chunk of dialogue from Mrs. Danvers last time that was really interesting. Made me like her so much less.
Oh my. Well, I can't wait to see where this goes. Without further ado, I turn things over to you and take us into the land of Rebecca.
Yes, thank you so much, Bo.
Thank you.
For those of you joining us, this is the version I am reading from. And yes, Bo has it wrong in the notes, but that's totally fine. We're doing chapter 19. And like I said, we just got a whole earful from Mrs. Danvers. Also, we have the wind going again today. So I thought, I called up Mother Nature and I said, hey, I'm reading Rebecca. Can you make it really windy again today? And she said, no problem. And I might have barking dogs again, like always. So that's what happens when you're home alone with scary music and talking animals. All right, so let's go. Oh, let's see what just... Okay, so the line right before, just so we're all... She and Mrs. Danvers were upstairs, and Mrs. Danvers just went off on everything. And suddenly, we listened, staring into the white fog together, and then we heard the sound of footsteps running on the terrace beneath us. It was Maxim. I could not see him, but I could hear his voice. He was shouting for Frith as he ran, and I heard Frith answer from the hall and come out to the terrace. Their figures loomed out of the mist beneath us. She's ashore, all right, said Maxim. I was watching her from the headland, and I saw her come right into the bay and head for the reef. They'll never shift her, not with these tides. She must have mistaken the bay for Carith Harbor. It's like a wall out there in the bay. Tell them in the house to stand by with food and drink in case these fellows want anything, and ring through to the office of Mr. Crawley and tell him what's happened. I'm going back to the cove to see if I can do anything. Get me some cigarettes, will you? Mrs. Danvers drew back from the window. Her face was expressionless once more, the cold white mask that I knew. We had better go down, she said. Frith will be looking for me to make arrangements. Mr. De Winter may bring the men back into the house, as he said. Be careful of your hands. I'm going to shut the window. I stepped back into the room, still dazed and stupid, not sure of myself or of her. I watched her close the window and fasten the shutters and drew the curtains in their place. It's a good thing there's no sea running, she said. There wouldn't have been much chance for them then, but on a day like this, there's no danger. The owners will lose their ship, though, if she's run into the reef, as Mr. De Winter said. She glanced round the room to make certain that nothing was disarranged or out of place. She straightened the cover on the double bed. Then she went to the door and held it open for me. I will tell them in the kitchen to serve cold lunch in the dining room after all, and then it won't matter what time you come for it. Mr. De Winter may not want to rush back at 1 o'clock if he's busy down there on the cove. I stared at her blankly and then passed out of the open door, stiff and wooden like a dummy. When you see Mr. De Winter, madam, will you tell him it will be quite all right if he wants to bring the men back from the ship? There will be a hot meal ready for them any time. Yes, I said. Yes, Mrs. Danvers. She turned her back on me and went along the corridor to the service staircase, a weird, gaunt figure in her black dress, the skirt just sweeping the ground like the full, wide skirts of 30 years ago. Then she turned the corner of the corridor and disappeared. I walked slowly along the passage to the doorway by the archway, my mind still blunt and slow as though I had just woken up from a long sleep. I pushed through the door and went to the stairs with no set purpose before me. Frith was crossing the hall towards the dining room. When he saw me, he stopped and waited until I came down into the hall. Mr. De Winter was a few moments ago, madam, he said. He took some cigarettes and then went back out again to the beach. It appears there's a ship gone ashore. Yes, I said. Did you hear the rockets, madam? Said Frith. Yes, I heard the rockets, I said. I was in the pantry with Robert, and we both thought at first that one of the gardeners had set off a firework left from last night, said Frith. And I said to Robert, why do they want to do that for in this weather? Why don't they keep them for the kiddies on Saturday night? And then the next one came, and then the third. They're not fireworks, says Robert. That's a ship in distress. I believe you're right, I said, and I went out into the hall, and there was Mr. De Winter calling me from the terrace. Yes, I said. Well, it's hardly to be wondered at in this fog, madam. That's what I said to Robert just now. It's difficult to find our way in the road, let alone in the water. Yes, I said. If you want to catch Mr. De Winter, he went straight across the lawn only 2 minutes ago, said Frith. Thank you, Frith, I said. I went out onto the terrace. I could see the trees taking shape beyond the lawns. The fog was lifting. It was rising a little in the clouds to the sky above. It whirled above my head in wreaths of smoke. I looked up at the windows above my head. They were tightly closed, and the shutters were fastened. They looked as though they would never open, never be thrown wide. It was by the large window in the center that I had stood 5 minutes before. How high it seemed now above my head, how lofty and remote. The stones were hard and solid under my feet. I looked down at my feet and then up again to the shuttered windows, and as I did so, I became aware suddenly that my head was swimming and I felt hot. Black dots jumped about in the air in front of me. I went into the hall again and sat down on a chair. My hands were quite wet. I sat very still, holding my knees. Frith, I called. Frith, are you in the dining room? Yes, madam. He came out at once and crossed the hall towards me. Don't think me very odd, Frith, but I rather think I'd like a small glass of brandy. Certainly, madam. I went on, holding my knees and sitting very still. He came back with a liqueur glass on a silver slobber. Do you feel a trifle unwell, madam? Said Frith. Would you like me to call Clarice? No, I'll be all right, Frith, I said. I felt a bit hot, that's all. It's a very warm morning, madam, very warm indeed. Oppressive, one might say. Yes, Frith, very oppressive. And what with a hot morning and standing about all last night, you are not perhaps feeling like yourself, madam, said Frith. No, perhaps not, I said. Will you lie down for half an hour? It's quite cool in the library. No, I think I'll go out in a moment or two. Don't bother, Frith. No. Very good, madam. He went away and left me alone in the hall. It was quiet sitting there, quiet and cool. All trace of the party had been cleared away. It might never have happened. The hall was as it had always been, gray and silent and austere, with the portraits and the weapons on the wall. I could scarcely believe that last night I had stood there in my blue dress at the bottom of the stairs, shaking hands with 500 people. I could not believe that there had been music stands in the minstrels' gallery, and a band playing there, a man with a fiddle, a man with a drum. I got up and went out on the terrace again. The fog was rising, lifting to the top of the trees. I could see the woods at the end of the lawns. Above my head, a pale sun tried to penetrate the heavy sky. It was hotter than ever. Oppressive, as Frith had said. A bee hummed by me in search of a scent, bubbling, noisy, and then creeping inside a flower was suddenly silent. On the grass banks above the lawn, the gardener started his mowing machine. A startled linnet fled from the whirling blades towards the rose garden. The gardener bent to the handles of the machine and walked slowly along the bank, scattering the small, short-tipped grass and the pinpoint daisy heads. The smell of the sweet, warm grass came toward me on the air, and the sun shone down upon me full and strong from out of the white mist. I whistled for Jasper, but he did not come. Perhaps he had followed Maxim when he went down to the beach. I glanced at my watch. It was after 12:30, nearly 20 to 1. This time yesterday, Maxim and I were standing with Frank in the little garden in front of the house, waiting for his housekeeper to serve lunch. 24 hours ago. They were teasing me, baiting me about my dress. "You'll get the surprise of your lives," I had said. I felt sick with shame at the memory of my words. Then I realized for the first time that Maxim had not gone away as I had feared. The voice I had heard on the terrace was calm and practical, the voice I knew, not the voice of last night when I stood at the head of the stairs. Maxim had not gone away. He was down there in the cove somewhere. He was himself normal and sane. He had just been for a walk, as Frank had said. He had been on the headland. He had seen the ship closing in towards the shore. All my fears were without foundation. Maxim was safe. Maxim was all right. I had just experienced something that was degrading and horrible and mad, something I did not fully understand even now, and that I had no wish to remember, that I wanted to bury forever, buried deep in the shadows of my mind with the old, forgotten terrors of childhood. But even this did not matter as long as Maxim was all right. Then I, too, went down the steep, twisting path through the dark woods to the beach below. The fog had almost gone, and when I came to the cove, I could see the ship at once, lying about 2 miles offshore with her bows pointed toward the cliffs. I went along the breakwater and stood at the end of it, leaning against the rounded wall. There was a crowd of people on the cliffs already who must have walked along the Coast Guard path from Carith. The cliffs and the headland were part of Manderley, but the public had always used the right-of-way along the cliffs. Some of them were scrambling down the cliff face to get a closer view of the stranded ship. She lay at an awkward angle, her stern tilted, and there were a number of rowing boats already pulling around her. The lifeboat was standing off. I saw someone stand up in her and shout through a megaphone. I could not hear what he was saying. It was still misty out on the bay, and I could not see the horizon. Another motorboat chugged into the light with some men aboard. The motorboat was dark gray, and I could see someone in uniform. That would be the harbor master from Carith and the Lloyd's agent with him. Another motorboat followed, a party of holidaymakers from Carith aboard. They circled round and round the stranded steamer, chatting excitedly. I could hear their voices echoing across the water. I left the breakwater and the cove and climbed up the path over the cliffs towards the rest of the people. I did not see Maxim anywhere. Frank was there, talking to one of the coast guards. I hung back when I saw him, momentarily embarrassed. Barely an hour ago, I had been crying to him down the telephone. I was not sure what I ought to do. He saw me at once and waved his hand. I went over to him and the coast guard. The coast guard knew me. "Come to see the fun, Mrs. De Winter," he said, smiling. "I'm afraid it'll be a hard job. The tugs may shift her, but I doubt it. She's hard and fast where she is on that ledge." "What will they do?" I said. "They'll send a diver down directly to see if she's broken her back," he replied. "There's the fellow there in the red stocking cap. Like to see through these glasses?" I took his glasses and looked at the ship. I could see a group of men staring over her stern. One of them was pointing at something. The man on the lifeboat was still shouting through the megaphone. The harbor master from Carith had joined the group of men on the stern of the stranded ship. The diver in his stocking cap was sitting on the gray motorboard belonging to the harbor master. The pleasure boat was still circling around the ship. A woman was standing up, taking a snapshot. A group of gulls had settled on the water and were crying foolishly, hoping for scraps. I gave the glasses back to the Coast Guard. Nothing seems to be happening, I said. They'll send him down directly, said the Coast Guard. They'll argue a bit first, no doubt, like all foreigners. Here come the tugs. They'll never do it, said Frank. Look at that angle she's lying at. It's much shallower there than I thought. That reef runs out quite a way, said the Coast Guard. You don't notice it on the ordinary way going over that piece of water on a small boat, but a ship with her depth would touch it all right. I was down on the first cove by the valley when they fired the rockets, said Frank. I could scarcely see 3 yards in front of me where I was, and then the things went off on the blue. I thought how alike people were in a moment of common interest. Frank was Frith all over again, giving his version of the story as though it mattered, as though we cared. I knew that he had gone down to the beach to look for Maxim. I knew that he had been frightened, as I had been. And now all this was forgotten and put aside, our conversation down on the telephone, our mutual anxiety, his insistence that he must see me, all because a ship had gone ashore in the fog. A small boy came running up to us. Will the sailors be drowned? He asked. Not them. They're all right, sonny, said the Coast Guard. The sea's as flat as the back of my hand. No one's going to be hurt this time. If it had happened last night, we should never have heard them, said Frank. We must have let off more than 50 rockets at our show, besides all the smaller things. We'll have heard it all right, said the Coast Guard. We'd have seen the flash and known the direction. There's the diver, Mrs. Woodwinter. See him putting on his helmet? I want to see the diver, said the small boy. There he is, said Frank, bending and pointing. That chap right there, putting on the helmet. They're going to lower him down into the water. Won't he be drowned? Said the child. Divers don't drown, said the Coast Guard. They have air pumped into them all the time. Watch him disappear. There he goes. The surface of the water was disturbed a minute, and then it was clear again. He's gone, said the small boy. Where's Maxim? I said. He's taken one of the crew into Carith, said Frank. The fellow lost his head and jumped for it, apparently, when the ship stuck. We found him clinging on to one of the rocks here under the cliff. He was soaked to the skin, of course, and shaking like jelly. Couldn't speak a word of English, of course. Maxim went down to him, found him bleeding like a pig from a scratch on the rocks. He spoke to him in German. Then he hailed one of the motorboats from Carith that was hanging about like a hungry shark, and he's gone off with him to get him bandaged up by a doctor. If he's lucky, he'll just catch old Philip sitting down to lunch. When did he go? I said. He went down just before you turned up, about 5 minutes ago. I wonder you didn't see the boat. He was sitting on the stern with this German fellow. He must have gone while I was climbing up the cliff, I said. Maxim is splendid at anything like this, said Frank. He always gives a hand if he can. You'll find he will invite the whole crew back to Manderley and feed them and give them beds into the bargain. That's right, said the Coast Guard. He'd give the coat off his back for any of his own people. I know that. I wish there was more like him in this country. Yes, we could do with them, said Frank. We went on, staring at the ship. The tugs were standing off still, but the lifeboat had turned and gone back towards Carith. It's not their turn today, said the Coast Guard. No, said Frank, and I don't think it's a job for the tugs either. It's a shipbreaker who's going to make money this time. The gulls wheeled overhead, mewing like hungry cats. Some of them settled onto the ledges of the cliff, while others, bolder, rode the surface of the water beside the ship. The Coast Guard took off his cap and mopped his forehead. Seems kind of airless, doesn't it? He said. Yes, I said. The pleasure boat with the camera people went chugging off towards Carith. They got fed up, said the Coast Guard. I don't blame them, said Frank. I don't suppose anything will happen for hours. The diver will have to make his report before they try to come and shift her. That's right, said the Coast Guard. I don't think there's much sense in hanging about here, said Frank. We can't do anything. I want my lunch. I did not say anything. He hesitated, and I felt his eyes upon me. What are you going to do? He said. I think I shall stay here a bit, I said. I can have lunch any time. It's cold, doesn't matter. I want to see what the diver's going to do. Somehow I could not face Frank just at this moment. I wanted to be alone or with someone I did not know, like the Coast Guard. You won't see anything, said Frank. There won't be anything to see. Why not come back and have some lunch with me? Oh, no, I said. No, really. Oh, well, you know where to find me if you do want me. I shall be at the office all afternoon. All right, I said. He nodded to the Coast Guard and went off down the cliff towards the cove. I wondered if I had offended him. I could not help it. All these things would be settled some day, one day. So much seemed to have happened since I spoke to him on the telephone, and I did not want to think about anything anymore. I just wanted to sit there on the cliff and stare at the ship. He's a good sort, Mr. Crawley, said the Coast Guard. Yes, I said. He'd give his right hand for Mr. De Winter, too. Yes, I think he would. The small boy was still hopping round on the grass in front of us. When's the diver coming up again? He said. Not yet, Sonny, said the Coast Guard. A woman in a pink striped frock and a hairnet came across the grass towards us. Charlie, where are you? She called. Here's your mother coming to give you a what for, said the Coast Guard. I've seen the diver, Mum, shouted the boy. The woman nodded to us and smiled. She did not know me. She was a holidaymaker coming from Carith. The excitement all seems to be over, doesn't it? She said. They are saying down on the cliff where the ship will be there for days. They're waiting for the diver's report, said the Coast Guard. I don't know how they get them to go down under the water like that, said the woman. They ought to pay them well. They do that, said the Coast Guard. I want to be a diver, Mom, said the small boy. You must ask your daddy, dear, said the woman, laughing at us. It's a lovely spot up here, isn't it? She said to me. We brought a picnic lunch, never thinking it would turn foggy and we'd have a wreck into the bargain. We were just thinking of going back to Carith when the rockets went off under our noses, it seemed. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Why, whatever's that? I said to my husband. That's a distress signal, he said. Let's stop and see the fun. There's no dragging him away. He's as bad as my little boy. I don't see anything in it myself. No, there's not much to see now, said the Coast Guard. These are nice-looking woods over there. I suppose they're private, said the woman. The Coast Guard coughed awkwardly and glanced at me. I began eating a piece of grass and looking away. Yes, that's all private in there, he said. My husband says all these big estates will be chopped up in time and bungalows built, said the woman. I wouldn't mind a nice little bungalow up here facing the sea. I don't know what I'd care for this part of the world in the winter, though. No, it's quiet there here when winter comes, said the Coast Guard. I went on chewing my piece of grass. The little boy kept running around in circles. The Coast Guard looked at his watch. Well, must be getting on, he said. Good afternoon. He saluted me and turned back along the path towards Carith. Come on, Charlie, come and find Daddy, said the woman. She nodded at me in friendly fashion and sauntered off to the edge of the cliff, the little boy running at her heels. A thin man in khaki shorts and a striped blazer waved to her. They sat down by a clump of gorse bushes, and the woman began to do paper packages. I wish I could lose my own identity and join them. Eat hard-boiled eggs and potted meat sandwiches, laugh rather loudly, enter their conversation, and then wander back with them during the afternoon to Carith and paddle to the beach, run races across the stretch of sand, and go to their lodgings and have shrimps for tea. Instead of which, I must go back alone through the woods to Manderley and wait for Maxim. And I will not know what we would say to one another, how he would look at me, what would be his voice. I went on sitting there on the cliff. I was not hungry. I did not think much about lunch. More people came and wandered over the cliffs to look at the ship. It made an excitement for the afternoon. There was nobody I knew. They were all holidaymakers from Carith. The sea was glassy, calm. The gulls no longer wheeled overhead. They had settled on the water a little distance from the ship. More pleasure boats appeared during the afternoon. It must be a field day for Carith boatmen. The diver came up and then went back down again. One of the tugs steamed away while the other boat still stood by. The harbor master went back on his gray motorboat, taking some men with him, and the diver who had come to the surface for the second time. The crew of the ship leant against the side, throwing scraps to the gulls, while visitors in pleasure boats rowed slowly around the ship. Nothing happened at all. It was dead low water now, and the ship was heeled at an angle, the propeller showing clean. Little ridges of white clouds stemmed from the western sky, and the sun became pallid. It was still very hot. The woman in the pink striped frock with the little boy got up and wandered off along the path towards Carith. The man in the shorts followed with the picnic basket. I glanced at my watch. It was after 3 o'clock. I got up and went down the hill to the cove. It was quiet and deserted as always. The shingle was dark and gray. The water in the little harbor was glassy like a mirror. My feet made a queer crunching noise as I crossed the shingle. The ridges of white cloud now covered all the sky above my head, and the sun was hidden. When I came to the further side of the cove, I saw Ben crouching by a little pool between two rocks, scraping wrinkles into his hands. My shadow fell upon the water as I passed, and he looked up and saw me. "Good day," he said, his mouth opening in a grin. "Good afternoon," I said. He scrambled to his feet and opened a dirty handkerchief he had filled with winkles. "You eat winkles?" he said. I did not want to hurt his feelings. "Thank you," I said. He emptied about a dozen winkles into my hand, and I put them in 2 pockets of my skirt. "Them's all right with bread and butter. You must boil them first." "Yes, all right," I said. He stood there, grinning at me. "Seen the steamer?" he said. "Yes, she's gone ashore, hasn't she?" "Eh?" he said. "She's run aground," I repeated. "I expect she's got a hole in her bottom." His face went blank and foolish. "Aye," he said. "She's down there all right. She'll not come back again." "Perhaps the tugs will get her off when the tide makes," I said. He did not answer. He was staring out towards the stranded ship. I could see her broadside on from here, the red underwater section showing against the black of the topsides, and the single funnel leaning rakishly towards the cliff beyond. The crew were still leaning over her side, feeding the gulls and staring into the water. The rowing boats were pulling back to Carith. "She's a Dutchman, ain't she?" said Ben. "I don't know," I said. "German or Dutch." She'll break up there where she's to," he said. "I'm afraid so," I said. He grinned again and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "She'll break up bit by bit," he said. "She'll not sink like a stone in the little un." He chuckled to himself, picking his nose. I did not say anything. "The fish have eaten her up by now, haven't they?" he said. "Who?" I said. He jerked his thumb toward the sea. "Her. The other one." "Fishes don't eat steamers, Ben," I said. "Eh?" He stared at me, foolish and blank once more. "I must go home now," I said. "Good afternoon." I left him and walked towards the path through the woods. I did not look at the cottage. I was aware of it in my right hand, gray and quiet. I went straight to the path and up through the trees. I paused to rest halfway, and looking through the trees, I could still see the stranded ship leaning toward the shore. The pleasure boats had all gone. Even the crew had disappeared below. The ridges of cloud covered the whole sky. A little wind sprang from nowhere and blew into my face. A leaf fell on my hand from the tree above, and I shivered for no reason. Then the wind went again, and it was hot and sultry as ever. The ship looked desolate there upon her side, with no one on her decks, and her thin black funnel pointing to the shore. The sea was so calm that when it broke upon the shingle on the cove, it was like a whisper, hushed and still. I turned once more to the steep path through the woods, my legs reluctant, my head heavy, a strange sense of foreboding in my heart. The house looked very peaceful as I came upon it from the woods and crossed the lawns. It seemed sheltered and protected, more beautiful than I had ever seen it. Standing there, looking down upon it from the banks, I realized, perhaps for the first time, with a funny feeling of bewilderment and pride, that it was my home. I belonged here, and Manderley belonged to me. The trees and the grass and the flower tubs and the terrace were reflected in the mullioned windows. A thin column of smoke rose in the air from one of the chimneys. The new-cut grass on the lawn smelt sweet as hay. A blackbird was singing on the chestnut tree. A yellow butterfly winged his foolish way before me to the terrace. I went to the hall and through to the dining room. My place was still laid, but Maxim's had been cleared away. The cold meat and salad awaited me on the sideboard. I hesitated and then rang the dining room bell. Robert came in from behind the screen. "Has Mr. De Winter been in?" I said. "Yes, madam," said Robert. "He came in just after 2 and had a quick lunch and then went out again. He asked for you, and Frith said he thought he must have gone down to see the ship. Did he say when he would be back again? I asked. No, madam. Perhaps he went to the beach by another way. I may have missed him. Yes, madam, said Robert. I looked at the cold meat and the salad. I felt empty, but not hungry. I did not want cold meat now. Will you be taking lunch? Said Robert. No, I said. No, you might bring me some tea, Robert, in the library. Nothing like cakes or scones, just tea and bread and butter. Yes, madam. I went and sat on the window seat in the library. It seemed funny without Jasper. I must have gone with Maxim. The old dog lay asleep in her basket. I picked up the Times and turned to the pages without reading it. It was queer, this feeling of marking time, like sitting in a waiting room at a dentist's. I knew I should never settle to my knitting or to a book. I was waiting for something to happen, something unforeseen. The horror of my morning, and then the stranded ship, and not having any lunch at all, combined to give birth to a latent sense of excitement in the back of my mind that I did not understand. It was as though I had entered into a new phase of my life, and nothing would be quite the same again. The girl who had dressed for the fancy dress ball the night before had been left behind. It had all happened a very long time ago. This self, who sat on the window seat, was new, was different. Robert brought in my tea, and I ate my bread and butter hungrily. He had brought scones as well, and some sandwiches, and an angel cake. He must have thought it derogatory to bring bread and butter and nothing alone, nor was it manderly routine. I was glad of the scones and the angel cake. I remembered I had only had cold tea at 11:30 and no breakfast. Just after I had drunk my third cup, Robert came in again. Mr. De Winter is not back yet, is he, madam? He said. No, why? Does someone want him? Yes, madam, said Robert. It's Captain Cyril, the harbour master of Carith, on the telephone. He wants to know if he can come up and see Mr. De Winter personally. I don't know what to say, I said. He may not be back for ages. No, madam. You'd better tell him to ring again at 5 o'clock, I said. Robert went out of the room and came back a few minutes. Captain Cyril would like to see you, if it would be convenient, madam, said Robert. He says the matter is rather urgent. He tried to get Mr. Crawley, but there was no reply. Yes, of course I must see him if it's urgent, I said. Tell him to come along at once if he likes. Has he got a car? Yes, I believe so, madam. Robert went out of the room, and I wondered what I would say to Captain Cyril. His business must be something to do with the stranded ship. I could not understand what concern it would be of Maxim's. I had an idea of what it might be. Oh. It would have been different if the ship had gone ashore in the cove. That was Manderley property. They might have to ask Maxim's permission to blast away rocks or whatever it was that was to be done to move a ship. But the open bay and the ledge of rocks under the water did not belong to Maxim. Captain Cyril would waste his time talking to me about it at all. He must have gotten to his car right away after talking to Robert, because in less than a quarter of an hour he was shown into the room. He was still in his uniform, as I had seen him through the glasses in the early afternoon. I got up from the window seat and shook hands with him. I'm sorry my husband isn't back yet, Captain Cyril. He must have gone down to the cliffs again, and he went to Carith before that. I haven't seen him all day. Yes, I heard he'd been to Carith, but I missed him there, said the harbour master. He must have walked back across the cliffs when I was in my boat, and I can't get a hold of Mr. Crawley either. I'm afraid the ship has disorganized everybody, I said. I was out on the cliffs and went on without my lunch, and I know Mr. Crawley was there earlier on. What will happen to her? Will tugs get her off, do you think? Captain Cyril made a great circle with his hands. There's a hole that deep in her bottom, he said. She'll not see Hamburg again. Never mind the ship. Her owner and Lloyd's agent will settle that between them. No, Mrs. De Winter, it's not the ship that's brought me here. Indirectly, of course, she's the cause of my coming. The fact is, I've got some news from Mr. De Winter, and I hardly know how to break it to him. He looked at me very straight with his bright blue eyes. What sort of news, Captain Cyril? He brought a large white handkerchief out of his pocket and blew his nose. Well, Mrs. De Winter, it's not very pleasant of me to tell you either. The last thing I want to do is to cause distress or pain to you and your husband. We're all very fond of Mr. De Winter in Carith, you know, and the family has always done a lot of good. It's hard on him and hard on you that we can't let the past lie quiet. And I don't know how we can under the circumstances. He paused, put his handkerchief back in his pocket. He lowered his voice, although we were alone in the room. "We sent the diver down to inspect the ship's bottom," he said, "and while he was down there, he made a discovery. It appears he found the hole in the ship's bottom and was working around to the other side to see what further damage there was when he came across the hull of a little sailing boat lying on her side, quite intact and not broken up at all. He's a local man, of course, and he recognized the boat at once. It was the little boat belonging to the late Mrs. De Winter." My first feeling was one of thankfulness that Maxim was not there to hear. This fresh blow coming swiftly upon my masquerade of the night before was ironic and rather horrible. "I am so sorry," I said slowly. "It's not the sort of thing one expected would happen. Is it necessary to tell Mr. De Winter? Couldn't the boat be left there, as it is? Not doing any harm, is it?" "It would be left, Mrs. De Winter, in the ordinary way. I'm the last man in the world to want to disturb it. And I'd give anything, as I said before, to spare Mr. De Winter's feelings. But that wasn't all, Mrs. De Winter. My man poked around the little boat and made another, more important discovery. The cabin door was tightly closed, it was not stove in, and the port lights were closed too. He broke one of the ports with a stone from the seabed and looked into the cabin. It was full of water. The sea must have come through some hole in the bottom. There seemed no damage elsewhere, and then he got the fright of his life, Mrs. De Winter." Captain Cyril paused. He looked over his shoulder as though one of the servants might hear him. "There was a body in there, lying on the cabin floor," he said quietly. "It was quite dissolved, of course. There was no flesh on it. But it was a body, all right. He saw the head and the limbs. He came to the surface then and reported it directly to me. And now you understand, Mrs. De Winter, why I've got to see your husband." I stared at him, bewildered at first, then shocked, then rather sick. "She was supposed to be sailing alone," I whispered. "There must have been somebody with her then, all the time, and no one ever knew?" "I know, Catherine, I know." "It looks like it," said the harbor master. "Who could it have been?" I said. "Surely relatives would know if anyone had been missing. There was so much about it at the time. It was in all the papers. Why should one of them be in the cabin and Mrs. De Winter herself be picked up many miles away months after?" Captain Cyril shook his head. "I can't tell any more than you," he said. "All we know is that a body is there and it has got to be reported. There'll be publicity, I'm afraid, Mrs. De Winter. I don't know how we're going to avoid it. It's very hard on you and Mr. De Winter. Here you are, settled down quietly, wanting to be happy, and this happens." I knew now the reason of my sense of foreboding. It was not the stranded ship that was sinister, nor the crying gulls, nor the thin black funnel pointing to the shore. It was the stillness of the black water and the unknown things that lay beneath. It was the diver going down into those cool, quiet depths and stumbling upon Rebecca's boat and Rebecca's dead companion. He had touched the boat, had looked into the cabin, and all the while I sat on the cliffs and had not known. "If only we did not have to tell him," I said. "If only we could keep the whole thing from him." "You know I would if it were possible, Mrs. De Winter," said the harbor master. "But my personal feelings have to go in a matter like this. I've got to do my duty. I've got to report that body." He broke off short as the door opened and Maxim came into the room. "Hello," he said. "What's happened? I didn't know you were here, Captain Cyril. Is anything the matter?" I could not stand it any longer. I went out of the room like the coward I was and shut the door behind me. I had not even glanced at Maxim's face. I had the vague impression that he looked tired, untidy, and hatless. I went and stood in the hall by the front door. Jasper was drinking noisily from his bowl. He wagged his tail when he saw me and went on drinking. Then he loped towards me and stood up, pawing at my dress. I kissed the top of his head and went and sat on the terrace. The moment of crisis had come, and I must face it. My old fears, my diffidence, my shyness, my hopeless sense of inferiority must be conquered now and thrust aside. If I failed now, I should fail forever. There would never be another chance. I prayed for courage in a blind, despairing way and dug my nails into my hands. I sat there for 5 minutes, staring at green lawns and the flower tubs on the terrace. I heard the sound of a car starting up in the drive. Must be Captain Cyril. He had broken his news to Maxim and had gone. I got up from the terrace and went slowly through the hall to the library. I kept turning over in my pockets the wiggles that Ben had given me. I clutched them tight in my hands. Maxim was standing by the window. His back was turned to me. I waited by the door, still he did not turn around. I took my hands out of my pockets and went and stood beside him. I reached out for his hand and laid it against my cheek. He did not say anything. He went on standing there. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "So terribly, terribly sorry." He did not answer. His hand was icy cold. I kissed the back of it and then the fingers one by one. "I don't want you to bear this alone," I said. "I want to share it with you. I've grown up, Maxim, in 24 hours. I'll never be a child again." He put his arm around me and pulled me to him very close. My reserve was broken, and my shyness too. I stood there with my face against his shoulder. "You've forgiven me, haven't you?" I said. He spoke to me at last. "Forgiven you?" he said. "What have I have to forgive you for?" "Last night, you thought I did it on purpose." "Ah, that," he said. "I'd forgotten. I was angry with you, wasn't I?" "Yes," I said. He did not say any more. He went on holding me close to his shoulder. "Maxim," I said, "can't we start all over again? Can't we begin from today and face things together? I don't want you to love me. I won't ask for impossible things. I'll be your friend and your companion, a sort of boy. I don't ever want more than that." He took my face between his hands and looked at me. For the first time, I saw how thin his face was, how lined and drawn, and there were great shadows beneath his eyes. "How much do you love me?" he said. I could not answer. I could only stare back at him, at his dark, tortured eyes and his pale, drawn face. "It's too late, my darling, too late," he said. "We've lost our little chance of happiness." "No, Maxim, no," I said. "Yes," he said. "It's all over now. The thing has happened." "What thing?" I said. "The thing I've always foreseen. The thing I've dreamt about day after day, night after night. We are not meant for happiness, you and I." He sat down on the window seat, and I knelt in front of him, my hands on his shoulders. "What are you trying to tell me?" I said. He put his hands over mine and looked into my face. "Rebecca has won," he said. I stared at him, my heart beating strangely, my hands suddenly cold beneath his hands. "Her shadow between us all the time," he said. "Her damned shadow keeping us from one another. How could I hold you like this, my darling, my little love, with the fear always in my heart that this would happen? I remembered her eyes as she looked at me before she died. I remembered that slow, treacherous smile. She knew this would happen even then. She knew we would win in the end." "Maxim," I said, "what are you saying? What are you trying to tell me?" "Her boat," he said. "They found it. The diver found it this afternoon." "Yes," I said, "I know. Captain Cyril came to tell me. You're thinking about the body, aren't you? The body the diver found in the cabin?" "Yes," he said. "It means she was not alone," I said. "It means there was somebody sailing with Rebecca at the time, and you have to find out who it was. That's it, isn't it, Maxim?" "No," he said. "No, you don't understand." "I want to share this with you, darling," I said. "I want to help you." "There was no one with Rebecca. She was alone," he said. I knelt there, watching his face, watching his eyes. "It's Rebecca's body lying there on the cabin floor," he said. "No," I said. "No." "The woman buried in the crypt is not Rebecca," he said. "It's the body of some unknown woman. unclaimed, belonging nowhere. There never was an accident. Rebecca was not drowned at all. I killed her. I shot Rebecca in the cottage in the cove. I carried her body to the cabin and took the boat out that night and sunk it there where they found it today. It's Rebecca who's lying dead there in the cabin floor. Will you look into my eyes and tell me you love me now? I'm just going to take a second. Just going to take a second. Take some coffee. Oh my gosh. So good. Chapter 20. It was very quiet in the library. The only sound was that of Jasper licking his foot. He must have caught a thorn in his pad, for he kept biting and sucking at the skin. Then I heard the watch on Maxim's wrist ticking close to my ear, the little normal sounds of every day. And for no reason, the stupid proverb of my school days ran through my mind. Time and tide wait for no man. The words repeated themselves over and over again. Time and tide wait for no man. These were the only sounds then, the ticking of Maxim's watch and Jasper licking his foot on the floor beside me. When people suffer a great shock, like death or the loss of a limb, I believe they don't feel it just at first. If your hand is taken from you, you don't know for a few minutes that your hand is gone. You go on feeling the fingers. You stretch and beat them in the air, one by one, and all the time there is nothing there. No hand, no fingers. I knelt there by Maxim's side, my body against his body, my hands upon his shoulders, and I was aware of no feeling at all, no pain and no fear. There was no horror in my heart. I thought how I must take the thorn out of Jasper's foot, and I wondered if Robert would come in and clear the tea things. It seemed strange to me that I should think of these things, Jasper's foot, Maxim's watch, Robert, and the tea things. I was shocked at my lack of emotion in this queer, cold absence of distress. Little by little, the feeling will come back to me, I said to myself. Little by little, I will understand. What he has told me and all that has happened will tumble into place like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. They will fit themselves into a pattern. At the moment, I am nothing. I have no heart and no mind and no senses. I'm just a wooden thing in Maxim's arm. Then he began to kiss me. He had not kissed me like this before. I put my hands behind his head and shut my eyes. I love you so much, he whispered, so much. This is what I have wanted him to say every day and every night, I thought, and now he is saying it at last. This is what I imagined in Monte Carlo, in Italy, here in Manderley. He's saying it now. I opened my eyes and looked at the little patch of curtain above his head. He went on kissing me, hungry, desperate, murmuring my name. I kept on looking at the patch of curtains and saw where the sun had faded it, making it lighter than the piece above. How calm I am, I thought, how cool. Here I am looking at the piece of curtain, and Maxim is kissing me. For the first time, he is telling me he loves me. Then he stopped suddenly. He pushed me away from him and got up from the window seat. You see, I was right, he said. It's too late. You don't love me now. Why should you? He went and stood over by the mantelpiece. We'll forget that, he said. It won't happen again. Realization flooded me at once, and my heart jumped in quick and sudden panic. It's not too late, I said swiftly, getting up from the floor and going to him, putting my arms around him. You're not to say that. You don't understand. I love you more than anything in the world, but when you kissed me just now, I felt stunned and shaken. I could not feel anything. I could not grasp anything. It was just as though I had no more feeling left in me at all. You don't love me, he said. That's why you do not feel anything. I know. I understand. It's come too late for you, hasn't it? No, I said. This ought to have happened 4 months ago. I should have known. Women are not like men. I want you to kiss me again, I said. Please, Maxim. No, he said. It's no use now. We can't lose each other now. We've got to be together always, with no secrets, no shadows. Please, darling, please. There's no time, he said. We may have only a few hours, a few days. How can we be together now that this has happened? I told you they found the boat. They found Rebecca. I stared at him stupidly, not understanding. Well, what will they do? I said. They'll identify her body, he said. There's everything to tell them. They're in the cabin. The clothes she had, the shoes, the ring on her finger. They'll identify her body, and then they will remember the other one, the woman buried up there in the crypt. Well, what are you going to do? I whispered. I don't know, he said. I don't know. The feeling was coming back to me, little by little, as I knew it would. My hands were cold no longer. They were clammy and warm. I felt a wave of color come into my face, my throat. My cheeks were burning hot. I thought of Captain Serrell, the diver, the Lloyd's agent, all those men on the stranded ship leaning against the side, staring down into the water. I thought of the shopkeepers in Carith, of errand boys whistling in the street, of the vicar walking out of the church, of Lady Crowan cutting roses in her garden, of the woman in the pink dress and her little boy on the cliffs. Soon they would know. In a few hours. By breakfast time tomorrow. They found Mrs. De Winter's boat, and they said there's a body in the cabin. A body in the cabin. Rebecca was lying there on the cabin floor. She was not in the crypt at all. Some other woman was lying in the crypt. Maxim had killed Rebecca. Rebecca had not been drowned at all. Maxim had killed her. He had shot her in the cottage in the woods. He had carried her body to the boat and sunk the boat here in the bay. That gray, silent cottage with the rain pattering on the roof. The jigsaw pieces came tumbling thick and fast upon me. Disjointed pictures flashed one by one through my bewildered mind. Maxim sitting in the car beside me in the Sound of France. Something happened nearly a year ago that altered my whole life. I had to begin living all over again. Maxim's silence, Maxim's moods, the way he never talked about Rebecca, the way he never mentioned her name. Maxim's dislike of the cove, of the stone cottage. If you had my memories, you would not go there either. The way he climbed the path through the woods, not looking behind him. Maxim pacing up and down the library after Rebecca died. Up and down, up and down. I came away in a rather hurry, he said to Mrs. Van Hopper, a line thin as gossamer between his brows. They say he can't get over his wife's death. The fancy dress dance last night, and I coming to the head of the stair in Rebecca's dress. I killed Rebecca, Maxim had said. I shot Rebecca in the cottage in the woods. And the diver had found her lying there on the cabin floor. What are we going to do? I said. What are we going to say? Maxim did not answer. He stood there by the mantelpiece, his eyes wide and staring, looking in front of him, not seeing anything. Does anyone know? Anyone at all? He shook his head. No, he said. No one but you and me? I asked. No one but you and me, he said. Frank, I said suddenly, are you sure Frank does not know? How could he? Said Maxim. There was nobody there but myself. It was dark. He stopped. He sat down on a chair. He put his hand up to his forehead. I went and knelt beside him. He sat very still a moment. I took his hands away from his face and looked into his eyes. I love you, I whispered. I love you. Will you believe me now? He kissed my face and my hands. He held my hands very tightly like a child who would gain confidence. I thought I would go mad, he said, sitting here day after day, waiting for something to happen. Sitting down at the desk there, answering those terrible letters of sympathy, the notices in the paper, the interviews, all the little aftermath of death, eating and drinking, trying to be normal, trying to be sane. Frith, the servants, Mrs. Danvers, who I had not the courage to turn away, because she, with her knowledge of Rebecca, she might have suspected, she might have guessed. Frank, always by my side, discreet, sympathetic. Why don't you get away, he used to say. I can manage here. You ought to get away. And Giles and Bee, poor dear tactless Bee. You're looking frightfully ill. Can't you go and see a doctor? I had to face them, all these people, knowing every word I uttered was a lie. I went on holding his hands very tight. I leant close to him, quite close. I nearly told you once, he said. That day Jasper ran to the cove and you went to the cottage for some string. We were sitting here, like this, and then Frith and Robert came in with the tea. Yes, I said, I remember. Why didn't you tell me? The time we wasted when we might have been together all these weeks and days. You were so aloof, he said, always wandering in the garden with Jasper, going off on your own. You never came to me like this. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered. Why didn't you tell me? I thought you were unhappy, bored, he said. I'm so much older than you. You seem to have more fun to say Frank than you had seemed to have more to say to Frank than you ever had to me. You were funny with me, awkward and shy. How could I come to you when I knew you were thinking about Rebecca? I said. How could I ask you to love me when I knew you loved Rebecca still? He pulled me close to him and searched my eyes. What are you talking about? What do you mean? He said. I knelt up straight beside him. Whenever you touched me, I thought you were comparing me to Rebecca, I said. Whenever you spoke to me or looked at me, walked with me to the garden, sat down to dinner, I felt you were saying to yourself, this I did with Rebecca, and this, and this. He stared at me bewildered, as though he did not understand. Oh my God, he said. What is it? What's the matter? I said. He whipped around and looked at me as I sat there huddled on the floor. You thought I loved Rebecca, he said. You thought I killed her, loving her? I hated her, I tell you. Our marriage was a farce from the very first. She was vicious, damnable, rotten through and through. We never loved each other, never had one moment of happiness together. Rebecca was incapable of love, of tenderness, of decency. She was not even normal. I sat on the floor, clasping my knees, staring at him. She was clever, of course, he said, damnably clever. No one would guess, meeting her, that she was not the kindest, most generous, most gifted person in the world. She knew exactly what to say to different people and how to match her mood to theirs. Had she met you, she would have walked off to the garden with you, arm in arm, calling to Jasper, chatting about answers, music, paintings, whatever she knew to be your particular hobby. And you would have taken it in, just like the rest. You would have sat at her feet and worshipped her. Up and down he walked, up and down across the library floor. When I married her, I was told I was the luckiest man in the world, he said. She was so lovely, so accomplished, so amusing. Even Gran, the most difficult person to please in those days, adored her from the first. She's got 3 things that matter to a wife, she said to me, breeding, brains, and beauty. And I believed her, or forced myself to believe her. But all the time I had a seed of doubt at the back of my mind. There was something about her eyes. The jigsaw pieces came together piece by piece, and the real Rebecca took shape and form before me, stepping from her shadow world like a living feature from a picture frame. Rebecca slashing at her horse, Rebecca seizing the life with her 2 hands, Rebecca triumphant, leaning down from the minstrel's gallery with a smile on her lips. Once more I saw myself standing on the beach beside poor startled Ben. You're kind, he said, not like the other one. You won't put me into the asylum, will you? There was someone who walked through the woods by night, someone tall and slim. She gave you the feeling of a snake. Maxim was talking, though. Maxim was walking up and down the library floor. I found her out at once, he was saying, 5 days after we were married. You remember that time I drove you in the car to the hills above Monte Carlo? I wanted to stand there again, to remember. She sat there, laughing, her black hair blowing in the wind. She told me about herself, told me things I shall never repeat to a living soul. I knew then what I had done, what I had married. Beauty, brains, and breeding. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. He broke off abruptly. He went and stood by the window, looking out on the lawns, and he began to laugh. He stood there, laughing. I could not bear it. It made me frightened and ill. I could not stand it. Maxim, I cried. Maxim! He lit a cigarette and stood there smoking, not saying anything. Then he turned away again, pacing up and down the room once more. I nearly killed her then, he said. It would have been so easy. One false step, one slip. You remember the precipice? I frightened you, didn't I? You thought I was mad. Perhaps I was. Perhaps I am. Doesn't make for sanity, does it, living with the devil? I sat there watching him up and down, up and down. She made a bargain with me up there on the side of the precipice. I'll run your house for you, she told me. I'll look after your precious Manderley for you. Make it the most famous showpiece in all the country, if you like. And people will visit us and envy us and talk about us. They'll say we're the luckiest, happiest, handsomest couple in all England. What a leg pull, Max, she said. What a goddamn triumph. She sat there on the hillside, laughing, tearing a flower to bits in her hands. Maxim threw his cigarette away, a quarter smoked into the empty crate. I did not kill her. I watched her, and I said nothing. I let her laugh. We got into the car together and drove away, and she knew I would do as she suggested. Come here to Manderley, throw the place open, entertain, have our marriage spoken of the success of the century. She knew I would sacrifice pride, honor, personal feeling, every damned quality on earth, rather than stand before our little world after a week of marriage and have them know the things about her that she had told me then. She knew I would never stand in a divorce court and give her away, have fingers pointed at us, mud flung at us in the newspapers, all the people who belonged down here whispering when my name was mentioned, all the trippers from Careth trooping to the lodge gates, peering into the grounds and saying, oh, that's where he lives, in there, that's Manderley. That's the place that belongs to the chap who had that divorce case we read about. Do you remember what the judge said about his wife? He came and stood before me, and he held out his hands. You despise me, don't you? He said. You can't understand my shame and loathing and disgust. I did not say anything. I held his hands against my heart. I did not care about his shame. None of the things that he told me mattered to me at all. I clung to one thing only and repeated it to myself over and over again. Maxim did not love Rebecca. He had never loved her. Never, never. They had never known one moment's happiness together. Maxim was talking, and I was listening. But his words meant nothing to me. I did not really care. I thought about Manderley too much, he said. I put Manderley first, before anything else. And it does not prosper, that sort of love. They don't preach about it in the churches. Christ said nothing about stones and bricks and walls, the love that a man can bear for his plot of earth, his soil, his little kingdom. It does not come to the Christian creed. My darling, I said, my Maxim, my love. I laid his hands against my face. I put my lips against them. Do you understand? Do you? Do you? Yes, I said, my sweet, my love. But I looked away from him so he should not see my face. What did it matter whether I understood him or not? My heart was light like a feather floating in the air. He had never loved Rebecca. I don't want to look back on those years, he said slowly. I don't want to even tell you about them. The shame and the degradation, the lie we lived, she and I, the shabby, sordid farce we played together, before friends, before relations, even before the servants, before faithful, trusting creatures like old Frith. They all believed in her down here. They all admired her. They never knew how she laughed at them behind their backs, jeering at them, mimicked them. I can remember days when the place was full for some show or another, a garden party, a pageant, and she walked about with a smile like an angel on her face, her arm through mine, giving prizes afterwards to a little troop of children. And then the day afterwards, she would be up at dawn, driving to London, streaking to that flat of hers by the river like an animal to its hole in the ditch, coming back here at the end of the week after 5 unspeakable days. Oh, I kept my side of the bargain all right. I never gave her away. Her blasted taste made Manderley the thing it is today. The gardens, the shrubs, even the azaleas in the Happy Valley, do you think they existed when my father was alive? God, the place was a wilderness. Lovely, yes, wild and lonely with a beauty of its own, yes, but crying out for skill and care and the money he would never give to it. That I would not have thought of giving to it but for Rebecca. Half the stuff you see here in the rooms was never here originally. The drawing room, as it is today, the morning room, that's all Rebecca. Those chairs the Frith points out so proudly to the visitors on the public day in that panel of tapestry, Rebecca again. Oh, some of the things were here, admittedly, stored away in back rooms, but my father knew nothing about furniture or pictures. The majority was brought by Rebecca. The beauty of Manderley that you see today, the Manderley that people talk about and photograph and paint, that's all due to her, Rebecca. I did not say anything. I held him close. I wanted him to go on talking like this. His bitterness might loosen and come away, carrying with it all the pent-up hatred and disgust and muck of the lost years. And so we lived, he said, month after month, year after year. I accepted everything because of Manderley. What she did in London did not touch me because it did not hurt Manderley. And she was careful those first years. There was never a murmur about her, never a whisper. Then little by little, she began to grow careless. You know how a man starts drinking. He goes easy at first, just one little at a time, bad bout perhaps every 5 months or so, and then the period between grows less and less. Soon it's every month, every fortnight, every few days. There's no margin of safety left, and all his secret cunning goes. It was like that with Rebecca. She began to ask her friends down here. She would have one or two of them and mix them up at a weekend party, so at first I was not quite sure, not quite certain. She would have picnics down at her cottage in the cove. I came back once, having been away shooting in Scotland, and found her there with half a dozen of them, people I had never seen before. I warned her, and she shrugged her shoulders. What the hell's it got to do with you? She said. I told her she should see her friends in London, but Manderley was mine. She must stick to that part of the bargain. She smiled. She did not say anything. Then she started on Frank, poor, shy, faithful Frank. He came to me one day and said he wanted to leave. Manderley and take another job. We argued for 2 hours here in the library, and then I understood. He broke down and told me. She never left him alone, he said. She was always going down to his house, trying to get him to the cottage. Dear, watched Frank, who had not understood, who had always thought we were the normal, happy couple we pretended to be. I accused Rebecca of this, and she flared up at once, cursing me, using every filthy word in her particular vocabulary. We had a sickening, loathsome scene. She went up to London after that and stayed there for a month. When she came back again, she was quiet at first. I thought she had learned her lesson. Bea and Giles came for a weekend, and I realized then what I had sometimes suspected before, that Bea did not like Rebecca. I believe in her funny, abrupt, downright way, she saw through her, guessed something was wrong. It was a tricky, nervy sort of weekend. Giles went out sailing with Rebecca. Bea and I lazed on the lawn. And when they came back, I could tell by Giles's rather hearty, jovial manner, and by a look on Rebecca's eye that she had started on him, as she had done on Frank. I saw Bea watching Giles at dinner, who laughed louder than usual, talked a little too much, and all the while Rebecca sitting there at the head of the table, looking like an angel. They were all fitting into place, the jigsaw pieces, the odd, strange shapes that I had tried to piece together with my fumbling fingers, and they had never fitted. Frank's odd manner when I spoke about Rebecca, Beatrice and her rather diffident and negative attitude. The silence that I always taken for sympathy and regret was a silence born of shame and embarrassment. It seemed incredible to me now that I had never understood. I wondered how many people there were in the world who suffered and continue to suffer because they could not break out from their own web of shyness and reserve, and in their blindness and folly built up a great distorted wall in front of them that hid the truth. This is what I had done. I had built up false pictures in my mind and sat before them. I never had the courage to demand the truth. Had I made one step forward out of my own shyness, Maxim would have told me these things 4 or 5 months ago. I think I'm going to stop there because we've gone an hour and this chapter is still like 10 pages long. So I don't want to run into everyone's time being taken up. So we'll stop there. We will come back next time. We'll be in the middle of chapter 20. We're on page 280 in case you are with us. I'm marking it. with this handy dandy little like magnet one. So I even know where on the page. Come on. Where on the page we are. Look at that. Snazzy. So I know there's I agree with you, Catherine. It's also like we got a lot of information in this hour. It's he killed her because he hated her. Like, oh my goodness. And now we get to figure out like everyone else who hated her as well. So yes, I will see you next time. And then we will continue on and we will find out more about Rebecca and the why and the how. And maybe we'll find out who that woman is. And at some point we have to tell Mrs. Danvers too. Okay, next time, have a really, really great day and be safe out there. See you soon. Bye.